Brother Vijay, man, it's a pleasure to get to meet you and sit down and chat, man. Thanks for taking the time, first of all. I'm grateful.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for supporting the music for all this time, even under the
Indeed.
most adverse circumstances, and holding it down over there.
True. We're trying, man. We're trying. Man, it's crazy. We have a mutual friend, a real close friend of mine, Derek Phillips,
Of
one of your first
course.
drummers, man.
That's
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
We go way back. We made lots of music together,
That's awesome.
traveled all over this planet, in fact.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, man. He turned me on to you really, really early. And man, it's crazy we haven't connected until now.
Yeah.
This is cool. This is really cool.
Well, I feel like
Um,
I know you since your voice has been in my ear so much.
oh wow, wow. Blessings, man. I'm appreciative. Man, check this out. I was reading a quote maybe about a day or so, and it made me think of you. It's a quote actually from KRS-One, one of our hip hop champions.
Sure.
And I'll paraphrase it here. He says, as generations change, people, groups, corporations are looking more for authenticity. He says, seek and ascribe value and validate as many things as possible and as many people as possible in your environment. Prejudice will kill your business model and output. Non constructive criticism can lead to poverty or lack. And I wanted to know from you early on, who are some folks that you affirmed when you were first getting started in this musical endeavor as a band leader, as a sideman? And who are some folks that affirmed you early on that made you have the juice to want to continue what you were doing?
Yeah. Well, when I was coming of age, I was living out in California. I moved out there in the early 90s.
Mm.
And, but actually, thinking even before that, I had a flashback to getting a chance to play with Jimmy Owens
Okay.
when I was in college. And talk about affirmation. I mean, just the way he really leaned into what I was doing and worked with it. I could hear him hearing me, it was one of
Uh-huh.
those feelings. And I could hear him really taking it seriously, and so that was a moment where I felt like, oh, this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Hmm.
There's a legacy, a way of listening, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and I'd say, like, over the years, people who have affirmed me just by hearing me and taking me under their wing or taking me on in some way. Um, I could name a whole lot of names. I mean, Francis Wong in the Bay Area, George Lewis, Steve
Hmm.
Coleman, Amiri Baraka, Butch Morris, Roscoe
Wow.
Mitchell, Wadada Leo Smith, um, really, and even actually in the Bay Area itself, the drummer Donald Bailey,
Oh,
you
wow. You
know,
play with Donald?
for sure, for
Oh
years.
my goodness. See,
And
that's
also
humble, man. Go ahead. Go ahead.
the drummer E.W. Wainwright.
Okay.
I don't know if you know about
I
him.
don't know him. I don't know
He
him.
used to tour with McCoy and Pharaoh, and
Okay.
he was in McCoy's band in the late 70s, early 80s,
Okay.
and just total fire, And I used to work with him in the California state prisons. We used to play
Mm.
uh,
Mm.
through this program called Arts and Corrections.
Hmm.
He had a group called African Roots of Jazz,
Okay.
and so, like, being a part of projects like that, where it was about me being myself in this context that was, you know, led by an elder, um, nurturing and affirming, particularly African American man.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I could also say, like, when I first moved to the Bay Area, I started playing in this jam session that was run by this guy Robert Porter in
Hmm.
Oakland,
Hmm.
and it's funny because I just read, Jeremy Pelt's new book of interviews called The
Oh yeah.
Griot,
Uh-huh.
which is fantastic. It's such an important document, and I know that there's a whole series of volumes of interviews he has.
Hmm.
But there's an interview in there with Ambrose Akinmusire,
Uh-huh.
who, we kind of just barely missed each other by, like, he was growing up, he was a kid at that time. So, but a few years later, he ended up kind of being mentored by the same guy, Robert Porter. And I found out that Robert Porter had been a Black Panther. And I actually had not known that about him, that was part of his history and that he was still very much involved in the organization. Anyway, so understanding not only that, not only just the experience of being affirmed, but understanding that to be connected to community, a community of mutual affirmation and mutual upliftment, if that's a word. And that's in fact a tradition, So and then in terms of you asked me like who did I put on, I'm not sure, like it took some time before I was really in a position to do that, but I'd say, particularly in the years after I came to New York, which was already, that's what, 22, 23 years ago, getting to work with a young drummer like Marcus Gilmore, or another young drummer like Tyshawn Sawyer. I'm talking about in the early 2000s. I started working with Tyshawn 20 years ago.
Wow.
And then with Marcus 17 years ago, and they were both quite young. In fact, Marcus was 16 at the time. Tyshawn was 20 when I first started working with him. So, so having, they were already in a lot of ways fully formed, and I found myself learning from them probably more than they were learning anything from me, but also just then having the platform, giving them the platform and giving them musical space to really stretch out and experiment and express themselves. So I guess, I think it's maybe in recent years I've become more aware of that side of what I'm doing, in the sense of like, I'm actually not just seeking opportunities, I'm also giving other people opportunities. And so I try to make that a practice through curation or through just who I am able to collaborate with.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. You brought up something. I'm just going to skip around a bit here. Drummers, in the present age, you, Charlie Hunter, and Nicholas Payton have picked some of my favorite drummers on the scene of all time. And I want to know what really motivates you, what gets you excited about hiring someone for the drum chair in your ensemble, trio, sextet, whatever. What do you look for?
I've been, I have to say, like, I've been super lucky. I can't believe it, actually, when I think about it, that the two most kind of formative members of the different ensembles that I've gotten to lead have been those two drummers I mentioned, Marcus and Tyshawn. So, initially it was like, well, who actually, and Derek fits in this category too. First of all, it's like, well, who actually wants to work with me? And that turns out to be quite self-selecting. Not everyone is up for it exactly, like in the sense of like, actually, because it takes some work, like, so it's sort of like sometimes you have to rehearse even if there's not a gig, just to try to like work on something and figure out if we had something to offer, especially in the early years. That was sort of the strategy, was like, we might just rehearse all day, because we're trying to break through into something, trying to discover something, we're trying to find something, and also try to arrive at it together, like to actually, which means like in sync, like in synchrony, and which means a lot of like very intense mutual attunement, So that means that those are the kinds of attributes that it's not only that I look for them, I think they look for me, in that sense. In that sense that well, who wants to go there, and who wants to really push themselves. Yeah, Justin Brown was another example, someone I got a lot of time with. I was very lucky to get to play with him a lot.
Right on.
So yeah, I've been spoiled for drummers in particular. And I think, it's a combination of, you want someone to be really anchored
Uh-huh.
in a
Okay.
way that uh, that there's like obviously pulse is paramount, right? Like the
Yes.
strong, a strong feel, a strong groove that kind of communicates so that it gets in everyone's bodies,
Yes.
uh, and then also I think in a sense of originality with sound, which is, I think, like, Marcus has become a very admired drummer for this quality, among many other things, but like
Mhm.
for his attunement to texture and touch, and the relative weight of things, and
Mhm. Mhm.
and and I always used to marvel at the way he would actually kind of like change the setup in the middle of a set or in the middle of a song, even to kind of bring out some other sounds, like
Yes.
swap cymbals
Yes.
in the middle of a song to actually, so that the outro might open up in a new way, and
Mhm.
suddenly like your ears would expand, because so
Man.
that level of real attunement, and it wasn't a gimmick either, it was really like serving the music, and so that's probably
Mhm.
the main attribute is
Yeah.
musicality is
Yeah.
probably the word for it.
Wow. Wow. Man, I like that. I like that. I like that. You kind of led me to my next point. With your first answer, I'm trying to think again. The alchemy of your style is really compelling. You mentioned AACM with George Lewis,
Mhm.
Steve Coleman, of course, with the M bass philosophy, if I can call it that. Um, Also Asian Improv Arts, which is a group that I'm just now getting hip to, but that you've been involved with since the 90s. And recently, I think you did a duo show with them. Was that right?
I did an event when I was visiting out there in San Francisco in when we were still allowed to travel. When that
Okay.
was
Okay.
early January, it was
That's my
early of
bad.
last year, January
Okay.
of last
Yeah.
year,
Yeah.
with Hafez Modourzadeh, an incredible
Right. Right. Exactly.
visionary
Mhm.
composer and saxophonist.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, all of these kind of I guess what I'd say is that these have been different efforts by artists to self-organize,
Mhm.
to help each other, support each other's efforts, and to seek a kind of self-determination, you know.
Mhm.
And that's like, that was, um, there's a historical context for that in a way, because it's like, the AACM was not one isolated experiment of its kind. It was actually that there was a whole movement of organizations like that across the US, like in cities across the US, and particularly among Black artists, self-organizing, trying to find their own way. So it was very much of its time, starting in the 60s and early 70s, the Black arts movement, the Black power movement. And so those organizations, and then Asian Improv was actually connected to work that Amiri Baraka was doing.
Okay. Okay.
So they were actually a kind of, well, he would advise them, and there was a kind of network of organizations that were grounded in different communities, different ethnic communities. So Asian Improv sort of formed in the East Asian communities in the Bay Area
Mhm.
in the 80s. And then they started expanding, and but it was really like they were community organizers on the ground who happened to be artists. I think that's probably the best way to put it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think like maybe kind of understanding those two efforts as linked,
Mhm.
so when we think about this thing that might be called the creative music movement, and so much of it was about it was a movement of movements, it
Mhm.
was like
Mhm.
in local, like in Chicago or in St. Louis or
Mhm.
in Los Angeles or in um, New York, uh,
Yeah.
these different moments where art, particularly African-American artists started self-organizing, putting on their own concerts, starting their own record labels. Um, there are a lot of different historical examples you can point to that
Mhm.
have given rise to some of the greatest music of the last 50 years,
Right. Right.
So, and then like understanding that arts and community organizing are sort of the same practice in a way.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm.
It really takes me to where we are today. And, and when I think about, you know, bouncing back or moving forward, after the pandemic and returning to work, um, how much do you think these lessons um, are coming into our employ? Do you think that there's a serious movement needed to jumpstart returning to work? Concerts, presentations. Do you think, as musicians, um, it's our job to really be at the vanguard of that? Can we really depend on um, the old system, if I can call it that, anymore?
Could we ever? That was the question, really.
Yeah.
It was never designed as a system. I'm talking about the superstructures like the record business.
Hmm.
It was never designed to take care of artists, right? And yet artists end up being kind of right at the forefront of change, in the sense like, uh,
Hmm.
not only in the US, because we are um, part of a kind of a gig economy and a sort of
Hmm. Hmm.
precarious workforce in that
Hmm.
sense, but also especially now that our livelihood depends on the ability to gather, and that is exactly what has been deadly for all this time, needless to say. So,
Hmm.
so uh, I already see it happening, that musicians are finding ways, they're finding ways little by little to um, convene in some regulated way or in some clandestine underground way or outdoors or online. It's been happening all
Hmm.
along, and so I think artists are always going to be right on the edge, exploring and finding out what's possible. uh, that's basically how it's always been.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think music has a way, I'm not the first person to say this, that music has a way of kind of prefiguring
Hmm.
changes in society.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think your latest release does just that. I don't know how you prepare when the creative channels through you, but your message is right on point, man. I've really been enjoying this record.
Oh,
Linda
thank you.
Mahon O and Tashawn Sori and you are just a dynamic trio. And emotionally, for me, um, the music, it feels like right now, with a little bit of hope, but a lot of reality. There's the ability to dream, but be grounded in like what we're feeling right about now.
Oh,
I do want to ask you about Uneasy in translating, what was originally intended for like a collaboration with dance.
yes.
How do you translate that to trio? Do you think about that at all? Or do you just say, hey, man, here's the piece. What we make of it is what we make of it. How do you really translate that experience?
It's a little bit of that, of like, well, let's see if we can do this first of all.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then also like knowing that it has to have a certain kind of impact, a certain, in the sense of, what a score for dance is an invitation to move, right? It's an invitation for action,
Indeed.
or for some
Indeed.
kind of like human coordinated action.
Hmm.
We could say that all music is doing that in some way. And the funny thing about making a record is that it has it becomes, instead of one collective experience, it becomes a lot of individual experiences.
Hmm.
People listen to it in isolation,
Hmm.
in their cars or on their walks or in their living room or on, in earbuds or whatever. Even if it's being broadcast, it's still creating a lot of private experiences, So then it's like, how do you, through music, give a listener a sense that they're a part of something larger than themselves?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the real question.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like there's always, I think we've kind of arrived at this collectively in a way through the kind of work we got to do together over the years, particularly the three of us have been on faculty at this summer music workshop up in Canada that Tyshawn and I co-direct at the Banff Center for Creativity in Alberta, up there in oil sands country. It's in like the Texas of Canada. That's how someone put it.
Okay.
But anyway, we were there every summer and like basically trying to, through our work, convening and trying to foment a kind of collective action, and music making was right in the middle of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of musicians you've heard of and know have passed through there, including like Joel Ross, James Francis, Samora Pinderhughes, Ganavia, all kinds of folks that Elena Pinderhughes.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, Adam O'Farrell, another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, lots of, and I guess what I've seen is that people bring that energy back, this like sense of we're part of something larger than ourselves. Right. We're not just in this for ourselves. I guess that's the way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like that ethos is somehow speaking through us, that sense of like, yes, this is the three of us right now, but it's also somehow this like exhortation or an invitation to everybody and to the collective, to the community, to us, a notion of us, And I think when music and dance is present together, it's kind of a version of that. It's a vision of like, well, this is how we are together. This is how we can be together. This is how we move together, And then in doing that, it means like, this is who we are together.
Indeed. It also has this pulse and buoyancy that on a visceral level, I think I feel first. And you mentioned something too that I wanted to touch on. As you seek to inspire and share with younger generations of artists, in that we are uneasy. We don't know what's next. How do you, or do you offer them any kind of encouragement? You can't offer them assurance, but how do you, beyond the notes, help to nurture them in a time when that we've never seen before, where things are very uncertain, where we don't know what opportunities they may have after they leave the tutelage of an institution or a gathering?
I think the biggest lesson is that we're all in it together.
Okay.
That it becomes it became a sort of joke, like at the end of each session. I mean, year after year, I'd say, guess what? We're family now. It was like really like that. Like you've been in this like kind of crucible, this bonding experience together for these weeks. And then it ends and it becomes like kind of tragic, like, oh, it's over. But then it's like, no, actually, we just got started is what we did,
Okay.
And to know that, and then also especially to ask people to take care of each other, to really like put that first, again, knowing like the business is not here to take care of us.
Right.
These structures, these systems, the record companies and festival promoters, they're not here to, they're not your friends, like they're
Absolutely.
you'll have some kind of mutually beneficial transaction with them, you know, and maybe repeatedly over years and years, but that's not you, that's not us, you know. So who we are together, how we take care of each other, how we hold each other up and hold space for each other, you know, that to me is the, you know, because often like what it takes to become, I don't know, like competitive in the market as like as a, you know, badass trumpet player, whatever it is. That's what that takes is like stepping over other people, you know. I mean, I have the same experience teaching at Harvard because like those are all kids who got there by competing with and winning, and which means defeating other people, right? So how, what does it mean actually to take that notion of success off the table if you can, you know, for a moment, and think about like how we are to one another and what we can, especially for the long haul, like for the decades to come that we'll be in this together.
Absolutely, absolutely. When I think about that togetherness, a piece like combat breathing, you know, art as protest action originally. I know that in this time, and I'm a firm believer that artists need to be compensated for their works. You know, we don't do it for accolades, we don't do it for pay. We have to do it, but there needs to be some kind of compensation, remuneration. But on the positive side, I think maybe in this time, as we've seen more people active online and doing their art, things like combat breathing and other messages musically that have been shared socially, um, have they been able to reach an audience maybe that you would not have reached, say, at a club that charges a certain cover charge, or a festival that is prohibitive for people who, you know, maybe come from our backgrounds, but economically don't have the means to celebrate or participate in the art that we're demonstrating? I just want to hear your thoughts on just
Sure.
access
Oh
in this
yeah,
time.
yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's funny. I mean, I remember having being on some panel years ago at one of these arts conventions, or maybe it was the Jazz Times convention back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
um, where the, you know, it always comes up that people kind of, you know, people love to scold jazz artists for like choosing
Uh-huh.
this art form that quote unquote nobody likes or something like that, you know,
Mm.
like that. It's sort of like held up for and when I say people, I obviously don't mean your listeners,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So who do I mean?
Yeah.
And what is that kind of like weird sentiment that we kind of get, like that we are supposed to somehow justify our existence in a way,
Mm.
and
Mm.
justify the art's existence um,
Mm.
in the face of just sheer ignorance, you know. And I remember saying like, particularly like that people would say that the music is not accessible.
Mm.
And I said, well, it's not actually a question of accessibility. It's a question of access. Like, it's the thing is like, if you, so, oh, this is in response actually to that, this like NEA survey, you know, they
Uh-huh.
do this survey every so often, maybe every year,
Mm.
called, you know, their survey on participation in the arts, you know, and then they'd ask people, did you go to a jazz concert last year?
Hmm.
And most people would say no, but they would follow up and say, why not? You know, how about like, what if the answer to why not is there weren't any? You know, I couldn't go to any because there aren't any in my city,
Mm.
or no one tells me where they are or when they are, or I can't afford them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or, you know, I don't even know where to find it, you know. Um, those kinds of questions, like that's the follow through. So what's the real situation with all that? I mean, how do people find this music and get, you know, put themselves in contact with this incredible living archive of some of the greatest music on the planet.
Yeah.
And why is it so hidden or sort of so marginalized? What's that about? You know, and
Hmm.
to me, the answer is always it's about white supremacy. It's about that. It's not really about anything
I hear
else.
you.
It's about white supremacy and anti-blackness and
Mm,
like forces that will marginalize this body of cultural work, you know.
mm,
And
mm.
so how do you cut through that? And then yeah, so that's the thing is like when I play at, you know, even the now defunct Jazz Standard, which was
Right.
one of my favorite places to play in
Me
the
too.
city.
Yeah. To go to. Yeah.
But then knowing that, you know, I remember a friend of mine came to see me there, and she's a woman of color, and she was taken aback that virtually everyone there was white and middle-aged or older,
Hmm.
mostly men, you
Hmm.
know. And that had to do with like who's able to get in, you know, who's able to find the wherewithal even on a weeknight
Yeah.
to spend what, however, you know, it might end up being 50 or 60 bucks a person, you know, if you include the food and everything else.
Right.
So that's the thing, you know. And so I've come to realize that this music actually reaches people in all kinds of different ways. And that's why I'm actually kind of, I have mixed feelings about the whole streaming
Hmm.
revolution, you know, because
Hmm.
it's like, obviously, yeah, we're making less than we make when you play my song on the radio. You know, it's like
Right.
less than
Right.
that. So,
Right.
um, but it has a way of being in people's lives in ways that weren't possible before, and in fact, all over the planet. And that's the whole. That's kind of the flip side of it is that like someone in Ecuador or Peru or Myanmar or like,
Yeah.
you know, rural South India can hear
Hmm.
me in a way
Hmm.
that they, or in like Botswana or, you know, like, I don't know, I have an audience in South Africa, you know, I have an audience in Senegal that I've found out about because they're able to access my stuff.
Mm.
And I didn't know that that was possible, you know,
Hmm.
that, so that's kind of a little bit of a different game now. I mean, we were used to a certain like exchange, like, well, a record has a certain value, which was itself totally artificial, right? But
Hmm.
now knowing that it can circulate and reach people across these divides of, you know, privilege and access, and that's like that's new. It's new in this century, and it's actually changing the way
Hmm.
it's changing our notion of us, our notion of community.
Indeed. Indeed. Absolutely.
Have a
Absolutely.
way of rambling. It's like you
No,
asked
no,
me
I
one
love it.
question and I
Oh,
answered like five other ones you
I
didn't
love
ask.
it. I love it. This
Sorry about
this is hey
that.
man, I'm happy to be here, man. This is fantastic. Um, I do have one more question. Well, actually two more questions. The first one would be now as a Newark native, I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee. I lived in Chicago for a little while and DC for a second, but Nashville mostly until moving to Newark last year in January, just before the pandemic. Um, but I'm a few years removed from actually getting to meet or encounter or hear up close Amiri Baraka. And one of the tunes in your catalog that made a huge impression on me was your dedication to him on your
Yeah,
sextet record, the trio
yeah,
track for
yeah,
Amiri.
yes.
Man, just share any memories of encountering Amiri and just the impact that he had on you.
It was immense. How much time
Mm.
do we have?
Take
I
your
mean,
time. Take your time.
I was, so, you know, some of the people who were actually connected to the Asian improv community, in particular, this guy named Greg Morizumi,
Mhm.
um, in 1996, matched me with Baraka. So I got
Okay.
to play with him. He came out to visit the Bay Area to do some talks and readings, and they set it up so that this bass player and I would accompany him on a performance. And so we kind of like we pulled it together in the very last minute, um, and that was the beginning of an incredible journey because
Mhm.
like it started that night, but then when I came to New York a couple of years later, I got back in touch with him And he's like, oh yeah, man, that first record you put out, that was a bad record. I wrote about it for this German Marxist newsletter. I'll send you the review. So he emailed me a review. And I was like, and I realized like one of the things he said in that review, which is now it's in the book called Digging,
Okay.
the compilation of his writings.
Okay.
He said he wrote about my feelings. And it didn't really hit me at the time, but after he passed in 2014, I went back. And so this is now like, 18 years later. And I've made a whole bunch of records. They've been reviewed by a whole bunch of, in particular, white men, all right? And the way that they tend and still do tend to write about me is not about me as a person, It's not about me as like a fellow human being. It's about the annoyance that I am, like some kind of, however I show up to people, like as some kind of mathematical nerd, intellectual, something like that, which is a way of, it's just coded like anti-Asian slurs, essentially. And then like when I went back to that review, I kind of like, I lost it. I just started crying because I realized that he was somebody who really accepted me as a human being, as a full human being with feelings. And the idea that my feelings might be in my music. Like what a concept, right? First of all, that I might have any, and that then they might be expressed and audible. And so like what I realized is that that's how he listened. And that's the tradition. In fact, the tradition I was talking about earlier, about all those elders who nurtured me, and him being, among the like very important among them, people who heard me, like really heard me, and heard me as a fellow human being, And that's how he was to all of us. I mean, he would show up for people. Like I remember he'd come to our gigs, and he'd be in the audience, like making requests. He'd could name like different compositions of mine.
School,
like,
old school.
Play Father's Spirit. He'd be like that. And I remember one time he brought Sonia Sanchez to see me.
Oh wow!
Which is, like incredible. I mean, just like being in that world with him, and yeah. And I remember the feeling at. So I was on that gig when at the Dodge Poetry Festival in New Jersey, when we did the poem "Somebody Blew Up America," and then some months later, someone decided that he was not allowed to say that, and so then that led to his poet laureate status being revoked, and not just revoked, but that the entire they revoked the existence of that position. So now there will never be a poet laureate of New Jersey. That was how hardcore it was.
Wow.
So, but I just remember being on that gig with him, and by then we had already been playing the poem in public, like dozens of times.
Right.
And I just remember the dignity and compassion, like, and kindness and clarity and humor, and just jokes for days. I remember we were backstage, and we were like the only people of color there. It was like his brother-in-law Dwight West would sing with us, and it was him and his partner Amina Baraka, and let's see who was on bass that day. I think it was Wilbur Morris and Firon Aklef. It was wild. And then me. So he and Herbie Morgan. Did you know him?
Wow, the tenor saxophone.
Yes, that's right.
I know some stuff with he and Larry Young, but I need to go deeper.
He's a man, because he went to high school with Wayne Shorter. They're like,
word.
That was the sound. They both had that sound.
Yeah.
But I remember he came backstage because it was time for us to play. He's like, okay, to the stage, please. All the Negroes and one Indian to the stage, please. Stuff like that, like constantly keeping us in stitches, because he would just name what was so obvious that no one would
Sure.
put into words. You know, he was that kind of guy. He was
Wow.
amazing. One of the greatest
Man, that's
spirits
beautiful,
and
man.
minds and
That's beautiful.
political thinkers. I mean, just one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah, man. Wow. Thank you, man. That's beautiful, man. That's beautiful. Oh
Yeah.
man,
Lots of jokes. Lots of jokes.
I love it.
And I also remember, I will say, like,
Yeah.
last thing I'll say, because like I made that album with Trio 3.
Yes.
With
Oliver
Workman
Lake.
and
Mhm.
Oliver Lake and Cyril.
Yes.
And that was in 2013, the summer.
Mm.
And we did a run at Birdland. And I remember he came to the
Wow.
run. And that was when I told him that I was going to start working at Harvard. And he was, I remember the face he made. He's like, well, don't let him change you.
Indeed.
You know?
Indeed.
And I think about that often.
Wow. Man. Wow. I think we're gonna just sit in that. I think we're just gonna sit in that. Yeah. I'll get you to hang on really quickly, brother. But thank you so much, man, for sharing. This has been a treat and a pleasure.
My pleasure, man. It's great to connect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.